So, welcome everybody to the June 2023 Bible and Beyond discussions. I am your host, Shirley Paulson, and our guest scholar this evening is Dr. Chad Venters. Chad is a professor of humanities and philosophy at Truckee Meadows Community College in Reno, Nevada. His PhD research at Middlesex University was on the parable of Jesus, sometimes known as the sheep and the goats. His special areas of interest include apocalyptic literature, gospel comparison, and the historical Jesus. He's also a Westar scholar. We're continuing this evening with our focus on the surprising things about Jesus. We've had one Bible and Beyond discussion on the topic last month with Paul Anderson, and we've had one podcast with Joe Bessler, blog post with Brandon Scott, Aaron Birncombe, and myself. And now we're about to embark on our second month, which will take us even further to the reaches of our imagination of the surprising things about Jesus. So instead of our usual focus on a textual study, we're going to take a look at more early Christian art. And if you've been with us on some of our other art presentations, you'll remember that Kateusz has talked with us about Mary and early Christian women, as well as gender politics in early Christian art. And Allie's with us also tonight because she and Chad have partnered on this discussion before. So our topic this evening is Jesus, gender, and the importance of Christian art. Unlike texts that have been redacted or altered by later interpreters, the physical remains of art tends to offer more enduring images of antiquity. Some of the artwork will challenge our preconceived notions of Jesus because other images have dominated our general art education about Jesus and the world he lived in. Okay, before we get started, I do want to remind you how much we appreciate your ongoing pledge of support via Patreon. To create podcasts and blog posts and Zoom discussions every month, we actually need financial support every month. That's why your monthly donations on Patreon are especially helpful. Please go to patreon.com, Bible and Beyond, to make a monthly pledge that's just right for you. But one-time payments on PayPal or checks are also appreciated. Thanks so much for that. All right, Chad, so welcome to you. We're so glad you're with us tonight.
Oh, Shirley, it's great to be here. Thank you.
What I'd like to do is have a chance to ask you some start-off questions, and then we're going to open up the discussion with everybody else in maybe half an hour or so. So how about if we start with how different portrayals of people impact the way we view figures and ideas? So maybe is that a good place for us to start with this?
Sure. I've been teaching a summer course in humanities. And so I have a coalition of half my students are from the US and half of my students are from Japan. To kind of kick off and to think a little bit about the nature of, imagery and, how figures and ideas can impact us. I think we have to understand it that there's cultural aspects to that. And ideas that become embedded in who we are and how images can impact our perception of ideas. So for example, this is one of my favorites. Can we still see the slides okay?
They look good to me. Yeah, thanks, Chad.
Perfect. So I commonly start my humanities classes by showing, an image like this. And I ask my students, who is this? And almost uniformly, everyone says the Buddha, right? The common image of the Buddha that we have. I say, okay. And so then I go to this image and I say, all right, now who's this? And they kind of pause for a minute at this point because they're like, and then they think about it for a little bit. And then usually I have one student who kind of, with a little bit of, hesitation goes, the Buddha, right? Like they don't really know. And so then I put the two images up side by side and I say, now let me get this straight, right? So you're telling me that the guy on the left is the Buddha and the guy on the right is the Buddha. Well, you wouldn't mistake these two people if you saw them together, would you? Probably not. And so we talk about this a little bit. And so what I explained to them is that the figure on the left, which is the common Western notion of the Buddha, is likely a depiction of a 10th century Chinese Buddhist monk known as a Budai, someone who may have been, say, an incarnation of the Buddha in thought, or someone who had achieved some kind of enlightenment. The person on the right is Siddhartha Gautama, or at least a depiction of him, the 6th century BCE figure from India that founded what we call Buddhism. What's interesting, more recently, to think about the cultural aspect of it, is that in my humanities class, where I have both Japanese and American students, all of the American students associated this figure with the Buddha. All of the Japanese students associated this figure with the Buddha. The Japanese students had no familiarity as a group with this image at all. Right, so it shows a little bit about the way that our cultural perceptions and where we are drastically impact the way that we see figures. And in some cases, also the way that we may be more accepting of certain images and ideas. So another example that I think might be prevalent to that is this is a depiction in the voodoo world of Papa Legba, who is a powerful and well-known Loa of voodoo thought. And there are actually images of Legba in Africa as well. He typically is known for having a kind of a very large phallus on most of these statues that we see of him. But this is a figure of African origin, something that, you know, that's practiced in Haitian voodoo as well. But if we were to think about, would it change the perception of this figure if we recrafted him to look like this? Of course it would. It would have a dramatic effect on the way that we see this figure. And this, by the way, is just a cartoon I pulled up of Socrates, right? So, you know, a classic depiction of you know, Socrates, you know, if you're a Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure fan. But the shift between how we would perceive that figure compared to this would radically alter the way that an audience would see it, right? So, for example, how would an African audience respond to this image versus the way that an American audience would respond to it? It would be quite drastic, right? And vice versa. So there is something to be said about the power of imagery and the way that we see these images, and also our cultural background as well, which I think is pertinent for some of the surprising things we get to look at tonight.
Yeah, this is really helpful here, Chad. Obviously, we don't have any images of Jesus during his lifetime. And since we're all kind of yearning to know what Jesus looked like, so are there any images that maybe would be guiding us in the right direction for Jesus?
Well, that's a hard one, Shirley, right? Because in addition to the fact we have no images, no one snapped a Polaroid, right? Like, we're just one member of the paparazzi. We needed them to do their job. They didn't do it.
Okay. Right.
We also have no descriptions of him. Like, the Gospels remain silent on this point. No one just gives us a little snippet. So I don't know that we can say that there's an image, a unifying image that scholars will say that, oh, this is it.
Okay.
A favorite that I have, that I like to use when I speak in forums like this, because it gets people thinking a little bit, is actually a forensic reconstruction that Dr. Richard Neves did a couple of decades ago as part of a Popular Mechanics article, and it was called The Real Face of Jesus. And what it doesn't mean is that this is Jesus's skull. They reconstructed the skull of a Palestinian man from the time period.
Okay.
And gave him the features that would be customary that we think would come up in a man from this period. And this is what they came up with.
Okay.
What I love about this image, right, is that this runs so very contrary to the Anglo-Saxon Jesus that we are most accustomed to seeing in our culture, right? You know, Jesus is a 6 foot tall white person for the most part, right? Always very clean, long flowing hair. I don't know if you've noticed this, but it's a fascinating point. When Jesus is, typically when he's depicted on the cross, especially, right, always has great abs, right? Jesus always has that chiseled ab area that, he's in great shape. Well, that's why I like to present this image, because, whereas we have a Jesus that in our culture looks a little bit more maybe like Bon Jovi,
Okay.
this Jesus, I think, gets us closer to what we would expect someone of the period to look like. But it also captures something important, I think, which is the foreignness of Jesus. Jesus wasn't a modern day European or American person, right? He almost assuredly was not Swedish looking, and gorgeous. This is someone, I think, someone pointed out once, and I think it summarizes it best. Somebody, when I showed this image, said, that guy is getting stopped by TSA.
Oh dear.
And that catches something, right? Because this person looks so contrary to the image that we've made more suitable for Jesus in our culture. And the other thing I like to do is I also then like to take a measuring tape, and I like to show what Jesus probably looked like height-wise, because from what we can probably deduce from the period, he would not be a tall man by our standards, right? So I happen to be a tall person. So I like to show what someone who probably was around maybe 5'3",
wow,
in the ballpark, right? Somewhere around that, what this person looks like. And you can tell the people, they kind of go, huh, right? Because he's not this tall, imposing figure that we've come to associate with Jesus. He's short, and he's Mediterranean, and he didn't speak English. And so I think it helps to get people to think a little bit about who Jesus was when they're in his origin, right? Not necessarily the religious construct that we make him.
Well, Chad, what about, are there some images of Jesus that came about later that would surprise us, that they didn't construct in the 21st century, or we've been thinking during our special focus on the surprising things, that the surprises aren't necessarily what we want to think about because they challenge our assumptions. So I'm just wondering if there's some real art that does challenge us this way.
Oh boy, howdy, there sure is, Shirley. It would be weird if there wasn't, right? Like if I was like, no, there's no surprises, right? Because that would really defeat the purpose of the talk. And I want to take a moment to just talk about, because for me, this journey is associated with my own, that my friend and colleague, Kateusz, led me on first back in 2019. So I'm sitting there in a room full of West Star scholars, and Ali is presenting, and probably like many of us, she starts presenting images of Jesus that we all go, wow. Right. And some of them are just like, how do we know this is Jesus? Right. Like people are just, they're so foreign in nature that people were just surprised. And so Ali has worked with me on this to get me great images. She's amazing. And I have some references at the end of this for people to look at. She's got some really good stuff available and some stuff coming out.
That's just great.
So we start with this one, right? And this one's really fascinating because you can get different reactions from it. One thing you might ask people is how many men do you see in the picture? And so for some people might see 3. Some people say, well, I see 3 definite men, and I see these 2 I'm not really sure about. And then there's this person, I think that's a woman pretty definitively, right?
Right.
Well, what we have here is Jesus and Jesus. Right. So here's Jesus from the raising of Lazarus, and here's Jesus with the betrayal of Peter and the crowing of the cock from the 2 brothers sarcophagus, which is a really fascinating sarcophagus. But what's really fascinating about this Jesus is that, first of all, we notice the very slender proportions, not a real butch masculine individual, but this flowing long hair that becomes such an intriguing part of this art that we see of Jesus from this time period. Thomas Matthews, who wrote a wonderful book called Clash of the Gods back in the early 2000s, the way he puts it in talking about some of these topics is he says that no Roman male would wear his hair like this. And that's one of the things that catches us is when you look at this Jesus, this is certainly not a a strong masculine looking Jesus. You don't have that strong beard or that, those chiseled features. You see the round face, you see that long hair, and you kind of go, And it's even more noticeable, by the way, you have Jesus next to Peter, right? You see all these masculine features with Peter that are not there with Jesus. All right. So another example we have here in the middle, once again, Jesus. Notice these, those kind of round cheeks, those soft features, and this long, luscious hair. And so you have, examples of apostles on either side and some Roman officials here. This is from the sarcophagus of the columns. And on another panel of this sarcophagus, what really stands out is that we have Jesus before Pontius Pilate. Now, Pontius Pilate has very strong masculine features, doesn't he? You notice that he's a man. And he's got that short hair. And then you look at Jesus in contrast to Pilate. Soft features, round cheeks, long, flowing, luscious hair that doesn't jive with a man from the period. And they get more interesting from here.
Oh my, okay, I'm ready.
The Arian baptistry at Ravenna, circa 500. What's captivating about this one is that, as you can see below the belt, the artist wants us to know that Jesus has male genitalia. He purposely instills that in the imagery. But up top, notice this sort of soft feminine features, the long hair, and this soft feminine face. And it really stands out when you're comparing this depiction of Jesus to the God of the Jordan here and John the Baptist. Both of those figures are highly masculine, beards, and they're rugged, and they've got big chests, and they look like manly men. This does not look like a manly man. This is a very feminine and soft looking figure. And that face, especially, if you look at that face, and you had no context for this, you could very easily distinguish that face as being probably feminine. And you might very well mistake the upper body as being pretty feminine. And in contrast to the other two, it really stands out.
Okay, you're right. You got our attention.
Yeah. So Blessed David. This is an apse mosaic from Thessalonica. This one's interesting because it apparently came with a tradition that developed quite some time afterwards, that the gender of it had changed from the virgin to the son when it was discovered. Now, where no one's really believes that. But again, look at this Jesus. You have this long flowing hair parted at the side, these soft feminine features, the slope, these like kind of sloped shoulders, not broad and masculine shoulders, sloped shoulders, the hips, people have noted sort of these broad hips that comes with it, sitting at a very awkward angle. This, apparently is attempting to put the Jesus into the position of the Son of Man from the vision of Ezekiel, chapters 1 and 2. And again, just very feminine. And they get even more feminine from this, because once we get a little bit deeper, now we get into a sarcophagus from San Francisco, Ravenna, 4th to 5th century. This is where an interesting phenomenon starts popping up, which is that Jesus has breasts. You'll notice on the sarcophagus, you see that Jesus has very interesting denoted breasts that pop out on the image. The soft round features, the hair is not quite as, bouffant as some of the others, right? But, you have Jesus holding a scroll of some kind. And then we see another image very similar to this from another sarcophagus. And once again, the breasts. The breast of Jesus, it's well documented in the art history. And again, here on this image, you see not only the breast, but you see, once again, the return of that long flowing hair that has popped up. In other words, what we have is a very fascinating portrayal of Jesus. And this is not all of the images. We've got one more we're going to look at that I think people will find very intriguing. And this is not the totality of what's available, but for the sake of what we're looking at, these are very intriguing portraits of Jesus that extend so far beyond what we are accustomed to, culturally speaking, that, like I said, when Ali was doing her presentation, you had seasoned biblical scholars raising their hands going like, this is Jesus? Like, we know this is Jesus? And the answer is yes, we do. We know this is Jesus from the history, from looking at the nature of the sarcophagi, the seated position of primacy, all of these factors. We know that we have a Jesus here that certainly defies most of our expectations as to the masculine butch Jesus of our imagination.
Okay, so then as we digest this here,
You're welcome.
Yeah, right. So could you tell us, what did the ancient world think about gender itself, or how would they have interpreted this? I mean, you're showing us that we're having a tough time, but did they have a tough time with that? What were they thinking then?
I'm positive that, like today, right? So when we think about today,
yeah,
we live at a time in which there is a tremendous amount of polarization over the issue of gender and transgender ideology and so forth. Right? We're seeing this in the news every day. Laws are being passed in droves during this past legislative session, firmly against LGBTQIA plus communities about these issues of gender confusion.
Yeah.
It's not a new issue. This is something to be aware of. And as I have looked through the literature and examined these things, what I think that we would have is probably a nuanced response to this, in the same way we would have a nuanced response today. And so in some cases, when we go back through and we look at the writings of someone like, say, Augustine, Augustine, at times in his writings, was just hopping mad about things like, these monks, they might become eunuchs, or they might grow their hair long, and the excuse for that is that there's a famous verse from Galatians, right, that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free, neither is there male and female. And Augustine did not like that response to this idea that these monks had demasculinized themselves. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's a big part of this, because for most of the ancient world, right, you're talking about a highly patriarchal society. And the idea that for some of these men, that someone would demasculinize themselves was just appalling. How could you even do that? Philo had harsh things to say about people who he considered to be androgynous. That word androgynous, men, women, would be one way of translating it. Just firing mad about it. Well, part of the reason why they're firing mad about it is because there are people from the ancient world who did not follow those traditional muy macho masculine ideals. And it would probably also depend on the period that we're looking at, say, in the Roman Empire. Because as we get into the later Roman Empire, you have deeper issues developing over things like masculinity, and Rome's failure in some of its military efforts later in the empire inspired writers to say that the problem is that we don't have the true men aren't there, right? The masculinity isn't there in our men. Likewise, you had views on masculinity to things like, say, for Christians in the earlier part of the church, as it spread and came into more and more territories. You had soldiers, for example, that refused to participate in the military service of Rome. Well, that was emasculating, mm-hmm. as an act at that time period. And so what you actually had are Christians attempting in some ways to validate their masculinity by saying that they're a soldier of Christ, right? Oh. And that their masculinity is bound up in these ideas that I fight the struggles of a spiritual battle, so I am masculine. And likewise, you would have had people who had responded to these things, and I think probably very openly. Now, the reasons, like we're going to get into that in a little bit. We talk a little bit more, like why might Jesus have been presented this way? Also a huge question with tremendous ramifications. We don't necessarily know for sure, but masculinity was a big part of Rome, right?
Just a second, I want to interrupt you for just a second.
Yeah.
If you're going to chat for a while, could we unshare the screen so we can see you talking to us? Or do you have another image you're going to show us right now?
Oh, no, no image yet. I think we're coming up for the next one. Yeah, because I think we have some text we're going to look at.
Well, the thing is, we have about 3 more minutes of you and me together, then we're going to open it up for everyone else to talk. So I just wanted to sort of zero in on
Sure.
How are you going to?
Let me do this.
Okay.
Let me stop my share for a second.
Okay.
And then I'll pull us up to an image that I think will catch some of our attentions even more so.
All right. Okay.
So let me zip ahead here a little bit, because there are also some texts that connect to this as well. But here's one that will really probably catch people's attention.
Okay.
So what you're about to see is an image of Jesus. And it's known as Cristo Docente, or seated Christ. And can you see the screen all right?
No, we're just looking at the red.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay.
This image right here,
okay,
which was discovered in the early part of the 20th century, was originally cataloged as seated poetess.
Oh.
They thought it was a woman. But when they started looking at it, they realized, oh, actually, this is Christ, right? Now, what of course stands out so much about it is that, because for instance, yesterday I showed my wife this picture and I said, what do you think? Is this a man or a woman? She looks at it, she goes, it's a woman. And I said, why do you think that? She goes, the boobs, right? You see pronounced breasts, you see this sort of a soft tummy area, the soft features and the flowing long hair. Though it was originally misidentified as a woman, they realized from having, say, compared it to these others, this is very clearly Jesus. But it's a Jesus that is so absolutely feminine that it fooled the people who were originally cataloging it to think it was actually a woman, right? Which, again, is shocking, right? Because we don't view that as being what we think of with Jesus.
Right. You're right. You got our attention.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, were there any other images of Jesus that weren't like this, or are they uniformly like this?
No, I mean, there's definitely more traditional views of Jesus, right? So, for example, traditional in the sense that they're more masculine. So, like this guy right here, right? This is Jesus, the raising of Lazarus. Notice the wand in his hand. This was a popular feature of Jesus's miracles, that Jesus had a wand in his hand, and he frequently used a wand for his miracles. And you see that this is meant to be sort of a younger looking figure, but certainly masculine. And when you compare it, for example, these are both Jesus. You really draw that contrast of the masculine versus the feminine. Likewise, in another apse, right, more traditional Jesus, right? Apse mosaic, right? This is big, butch, manly, I've got hair on my face Jesus, right? And this is a Jesus that people are very comfortable with. And once again, when you compare it to the other apse, notice the stark contrast. It really draws out the very masculine versus the very feminine look that we have of Jesus in these various artworks. And it aligns theoretically with a number of things that we read in the Gospel of Thomas or the Apocryphon of John. There's all sorts of reasons why this might be the way it is. We're not really sure, but there's all sorts of possibilities as to why we're seeing this Jesus that we might call at points an intersex Jesus, a Jesus that clearly has male and female going on at the same time, a Jesus like with seated Christ that we might just simply call transgender, because this Jesus is so utterly feminine to defy the very notion of masculinity altogether. It's remarkable.
Okay. Well, you have awakened us to a new concept here of expanding our minds. This is about the time in our program where we sort of turn it over to our guests or our friends here to talk about this together with you. So we're going to just open this up for conversation. And you are, let's see, I'm trying to think how I'm going to see all your hands here. I think if you use the raise hand feature, I'll be able to see you and call on you. I mean, you can ask questions or whatever. So Maureen, I think you're first. Why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself?
I've got an out of the box, way out of the box question.
Sure.
And again, I'm coming from a position of a layperson, not knowing a whole lot about this, but I'm thinking that maybe the people that could afford to be artists might have had to have patrons. Is there any chance that they could have been portraying Jesus as less than masculine as a way to undercut his mission, what he really was, portray a false picture of him? I don't have any problem with Jesus being feminine. I have no problem with that. I just was wondering if could they be portraying a false image of him because whoever paid for their mosaics and their paints, I don't know. Anyway, I told you it was out of the box.
That's right. No, it's a good question, right? And I think that we would have to start with that from the inception point of what do we mean by a false image? Because we have no image of Jesus, right? That puts us in the original problem, right? Because it's kind of like with of butch, bearded, long-haired Jesus, right? We don't really know if that's a true picture of Jesus. That's the one we're comfortable with, but we don't really know if that's Jesus. I would say very unlikely for a number of reasons, right? Is that you have these apses in churches, right? So these are, you have them in churches. They're also on sarcophagi. And these sarcophagi are being funded by Christians for their burial. And they're very ornate, right? They're detailed, and actually they also quite commonly include a picture of the couple on the sarcophagus, which once again, for my friend Allie, her analysis of the two brothers sarcophagus, super interesting. But I don't think it would be intended as like a mockery per se, because first of all, we don't know what Jesus looked like. There's a number of possibilities, though. Some have suggested that perhaps it was a more palatable approach to Jesus in the transition from pagan to Christian thought, because some of these images could be associated with, say, a Dionysus or an Apollo. That's possible, right? Likewise, it could also be, I think, very realistically, that maybe not everybody held those highly over masculine ideals. There's also a sense of reflection on this, right? Because we think about Jesus in this time period. Jesus isn't really a historical figure they're aiming for. They're not thinking to ourselves, what's the historical Jesus look like? Jesus is a divine construct for much of this. He's a theological idea. And part of that is being Jesus for many of these folks is God, or at least a God, depending on where you are on that spectrum. Well, in Genesis, we have this notion that God creates male and female in his image. Is it possible that you also have people combining male and female into the figure of Jesus to reflect that divine nature, or to reflect the fact that Jesus is a savior for all? Because some have pointed out the question, can a male savior also be the savior for women? Right? And it's a fair question to ask, right? You kind of get into the theological analysis. So I think it's a great question. We don't really know. See, this is the problem. There was no Facebook at the time, right? If there was Facebook, we would have 5,000 posts by these guys talking about the process and the method. We don't have that, right? We've lost all that to history. Now I know more about what my friends eat for dinner because of social media than I do about some of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world, because we don't have their perspective. But I don't think it was probably a slight. I think that there's various reasons why, for positive positive outlooks, they would have portrayed Jesus this way.
I want to move
Thank
on.
you.
Thank you. I want to move on to Peggy. Peggy, what's your comment or question?
First, I want to represent the chat. And Joan put a comment in saying that she really likes the actor as Jesus in Chosen. He looks more Middle Eastern, but not as extreme as the image that we had just seen when she posted.
Mm-hmm.
And someone else had an idea, who was that, I think LJ, that maybe the image was looking more like the patron that the artist was doing. I was wondering about the average Joe that's carving out the sarcophagus, and the idea was answered for me when you said it was the Christian that had paid for that work, and they would have theological ideas. And that to me answers that question, because I can't picture the average Joe going, I think I'll make this one androgynous or more feminine or whatever.
Yeah.
So that was really helpful for me to think of that idea that it's actually the person that commissioned the work and their theological ideas.
Let me throw a wrinkle in there too, Peggy, because this is part of it. One of the issues that comes up with this is that we're not talking about an imagery of Jesus that popped up in one little network. That's what makes this even more intriguing. We find this androgynous Jesus in Thessalonica, in Ravenna, in Rome, and then all the way north into Gaul. It's a multi-regional phenomenon. And so that's part of what makes it even more fascinating, is that it could be maybe just dismissed as being some wacky group, right? If it was all just in one place, that's Bob's church. They're a little nutty down there. But that's not what happened. We have this construct of Jesus in deeply feminine terms popping up at regions around the empire. And the truth is, there was probably a lot more that we'll never know about because it's been lost in history. That's the other thing that's kind of frustrating. This is just what we have left that we can examine. We don't even know the full scope of what this looked like in much of this. So that does throw in a little bit of a wrinkle to this, is why this is happening in various places around the empire. It's not just one little area.
Yep.
And Alexis, your turn.
Hi. How, if something were to get miscategorized or misidentified, how would you determine that it was identified wrong? And then, how would that happen?
Good question. So in this case, whenever they had originally miscatalogued the seated Christ, they had other scholars that came along and looked at it who were familiar with some of the imagery, and they went, oh, actually, no, this isn't a female, right? This is Jesus. And I think part of what probably helped with it was that the image of Jesus, you see the hair, right? You see the long flowing hair. We might commonly expect, say, a woman to maybe have a veil over her head. That might also be an indication that you have a woman. In this case, they didn't have that. But once they started looking at this comparatively, they said, no, this is Jesus, the same extending out the hand, the whole process. So that's pretty much how it goes, right? Is you have groups of scholars who can work together and who share in sort of their mutual backgrounds to go, oh, I actually know this is a Jesus. So it's pretty fascinating. Yeah, and that's what it's all hashtag teamwork, right? That's what you need, is you need those people with those various backgrounds who can come in, because I would have mistaken it too. I would not have. If I was looking at that and cataloging it, my first thought wouldn't have been Jesus. My first thought would have been, well, this is a woman of some kind. But once you compare it with the rest of what we know about Jesus, it falls into place.
Very interesting. All right, Patricia Jacobson, you need to unmute yourself, Patricia.
Sorry.
Okay.
After Jesus and before Christianity sort of led us to believe that perhaps the congregations or the people following Jesus were more, there was a greater number of women than men. And if you look back through the history of the church, there's a greater number of women in the church congregation than the men. Is this likely to have influenced how the Jesus is portrayed?
A great question. And I think that's certainly one of the possibilities. Something else that stands out to me about this is in thinking about Matthew 19. So in Matthew 19, we have a very fascinating statement by Jesus in which he acknowledges eunuchs for the kingdom of God. What's so intriguing about that is that eunuchs had a very poor reputation through this period and beyond. Eunuchs were a distrusted group, and they were others who, by the way, had been accused of sacrificing their masculinity because they had removed some part of their masculine self. And what's interesting about the way that Jesus uses it is he mentions people who are born eunuchs, people who are made eunuchs, and those who make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God, which is really intriguing because those are the three ways in which classically eunuchs were identified: people who had questionable genitalia at birth, people who were made eunuchs by others, oftentimes, as part of slavery or taken into service. And then you also had people who made themselves eunuchs as part of their religious devotion. And what's fascinating is in Kufler, for example, he describes some of the ways in which eunuchs were described from this period. And one of the things that stands out to me is he talks about how eunuchs were known because of their low androgen levels, that they had long limbs, susceptibility to curvature of the spine and osteoporosis, in sallow skin prone to premature wrinkles, and in tendencies to increased fat deposits in the abdomen, breasts, and buttocks. And so this was another thing that, for the masculine men of the Roman Empire, the grossness of the eunuch looking too much like a woman. Well, some of these depictions of Jesus, we might ask ourselves, is this a eunuch Jesus? Is it an intersex Jesus? Great question, right? We don't have the definitive answer to that, but I think that there is some excellent exploration. Allie's written some great stuff on this, and she's got new stuff coming out as well that explores some of these issues, because you have a whole spectrum of thought. And so it could be from what the Westar called the gender bending that we find in this period. Is it a eunuch Jesus? Is it a Jesus that's an amalgam of man and woman because he's divine? There's a variety of possibilities that come up with all of these pieces of art.
Very interesting as always here. All right, Arnold, what about you?
How long after Jesus' life did artwork that's representative of the images of Jesus that you've been talking about first appear?
So in terms of these particular artworks that we're looking at, these are predominantly from approximately 300 to 600. So you're getting into that period of Constantine, right? Which in some ways makes it even more intriguing, right? Because you have a lot of these artworks that are coming up in a post-Constantinian era. I mean, don't get me wrong. It isn't like because, they called Nicaea in 325 that suddenly everyone just adopted the Nicene Creed and everyone forgot about Arianism, right? Arianism continued on long after this. Perspectives on Jesus continued on long after this. Some of our earliest images, the Alexamenos graffiti, which is super intriguing because it's probably a satire. It depicts Jesus on a cross with a donkey head and a man worshiping him. Alexamenos worships God, the ass that got himself crucified. And then you also have images like the Good Shepherd that show Jesus very young and smooth-faced, but not highly feminized per se. These you get into, you've got Jesus as being both highly feminine and masculine going on in tandem. Really intriguing. But I don't think it should surprise us, because we've kind of been led to believe that there is one Christianity, so to speak, right? But we know, in our historical studies that there wasn't just one Christianity. There was a Christianity that developed as a complex over a tremendous amount of time. And our literature affirms that as well. You see in the Gospel of Thomas, for example, when you make the two and the one, you make the male like the female, so they become a single one. You have these various texts that cross the lines of gender in ways that would sound very foreign to, say, a more conservative Christian background.
So, Allie, I saw that you had raised your hand a minute. Did you want to say something about this? You got to get unmuted.
You have to unmute, Allie.
Yes, there we go. There is a couple of images of Jesus in the Dura Europos Baptistry church in ancient Syria, or just outside of ancient Syria, which are dated around 236. It's a scene of Jesus and Peter and walking on the water, and also Jesus raising, the boy that carries his bed on his back, helping the lame. And although the images today that have been restored in the Princeton, I believe it's the Yale Museum, have been restored. If you look at the original drawings that the archaeologists made on site, you can see that Jesus's hair there is even not as curly as this, but still distinctively longer than and kind of bouffant than the other men in the scenes. So I think, in answer to that question, when did it start? I think it started, you can identify this trend very, at the beginning of early Christian art, identifying Jesus, except for the one with the donkey's head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Allie. That's really helpful. Okay, Linda Green.
Well, I have been recently looking at images. The people who are working on the Shroud of Turin say that the image on the cloth, it's likely to be Jesus. It has not been proven that it's not Jesus. And they have recreated the image of Jesus from the shroud in a very 3D life-like recreation of the actual size of the body and what it looked like after the crucifixion. And also there was a theory that I thought was very interesting, that after several centuries, the Shroud of Turin had been seen, and that's when the image of Jesus changed to the bearded masculine image that we think of as been more commonly the image of Jesus. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting, the image of Jesus from the people who have been working on recreating this image from the shroud. Mm-hmm. Very much like you showed the image in the year 400. It was much more masculine, mm-hmm. which comes much more closely to what they say the image of the shroud looked like.
Did you want to make any comments on that, Chad, or should we go on to Peggy's question or comment?
No, yeah, it's very interesting, right? And Turin, like the Shroud of Turin, there's been, there's decades of really intriguing study on it, right? It's a really fascinating piece. I remember watching documentaries on it when I was an undergraduate, and so I think it's a fascinating piece of art, right, to examine and to kind of deal with some of those issues. But no, I thank you, Linda. That's a great comment.
And Peggy.
And I'm just representing the chat here. Ellie did a post on Unix and Matthew 19 for Bible search and rescue that may be of interest. And so if you look in the chat, there's a link, and it looks like the title of it might have been, Does the Bible Condemn Transgender People? And so that would be interesting to read afterwards. There's a complete link. We could have a continued discussion about Galatians 3:28 and a context that deified the Roman gender binary. So much to discuss. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Chad, Allie, Shirley, and everyone. I wish I didn't have to manage another meeting in a few minutes. Ellie had let me know that she was going to have to leave. So I was glad that she was able to work us in for a little bit.
Yeah, and that's an outstanding article that Ellie wrote for Bible Search and Rescue. Check that out. And there's been some good ones on there. Ellie has wrote some killer articles. Perry Key wrote, an outstanding one about, this I think is an area where much of this is important, right? Because for many people in the modern world, as throughout history, but in our own time, we've seen so many individuals, especially in the LGBTQIA+ community, that have essentially been told you're on the outside of what this religious world means. You're on the outside of Christianity. Where I think the study of the broader world of Christian scholarship is so prevalent is to show these folks to say, hey, there were actually Christians who were quite like you and thought like you and presented Jesus in ways that are far more in line with the, highly feminized iterations of what it means to be a man or to be transgender altogether, the actual gender switching, or at times the intersex Jesus, a Jesus that shows characteristics of both, androgynous, as it were. And I think that's remarkably valuable for people who have been told basically that they don't have a place within the Christian world. Yes, you do. And you deserve so much better than what has been given to you by so many groups of people. And this is where there is such a tremendous value in examining the depths of some of these areas, because whether it's, two brothers, mystical Gospel of Mark, the list goes on and on of important text for people to see that there is more to Christianity than just this one iteration that has been deemed, say, orthodoxy, which realistically, if we're talking about the historical development of Christianity, what looked like orthodoxy in the year 400 looks nothing like what you would see in a church today, right? It would look completely foreign if you were to time travel from one to the other. But I think that there's tremendous value in understanding this and to look at this and to tell folks who have been told you're on the outside looking in, you're not alone. And that I think that there was a barrage of people in that, even though they wouldn't have been categorized as that community, but in that community in the past, who had very strong feelings, important, profound, affectionate feelings of worship for the figure of Jesus.
Oh, Ted, you know what? We are winding down to the final minutes here, and I'm wondering, with about 5 minutes left, you had a couple of quotes that I thought were really interesting. Do you think you have one or two that you might want to share with us before we close out here?
Were you talking from the scriptures that we were looking at?
You had shown me on your PowerPoint. I think you had at the end some passages.
Yeah. So on the PowerPoint, I talked about the eunuch from Matthew 19, and check out Ellie's article on that. But some of the text, right? This isn't just an artistic issue. This is also a textual issue as well. We also see things such as Jesus saw some babies nursing. He said to his disciples, these nursing babies are like those who enter the Father's empire. They said to him, so do we have to enter the Father's empire as babies? Jesus said to them, when you make the two into one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the upper like the lower, and when you make male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male, nor the female be female, when you make eyes in place of an eye, a hand in place of a hand, a foot in place of a foot, an image in place of an image, then you will enter the Father's empire. Gospel of Thomas, saying 22. One more, since I know we're coming short, from the three forms of first thought, from the perspective of God. I am androgynous. I am mother and father. I copulate with myself. I copulate with myself and those who love me, and through me alone all are standing firm. In other words, this is not something we just see in art. We also see this in text. It may have been text that was rejected by the branch of Christianity that we would call maybe like, say, Western Orthodoxy. But there's certainly a barrage of intriguing texts that I think deserve a deeper look, because sometimes they are ignored. That last quote was from Three Forms of First Thoughts, also known as the trimorphic protonoia. That particular one was from the Barnstone and Marvin Meyer translation that you can find in the Gnostic Bible.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Well, so you have certainly pushed us and stretched us and wiggled us around a lot. I know we have a lot to think about. Do you have any recommendations on how we might go from here? Like, what should we look at next, or how do we think about this? Or
sure. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to put up some references that I think would be very valuable. Okay. Like I've said, I have nothing but the highest of regards for my friend and colleague, Kateusz, who has done some amazing work. Let's see here. Let's just go to the end. There we go. So here are some references that you could use in your study. A couple of great papers by Ali, books, Art and the Christian Apocrypha. This article right here, Eunuchs and the Post-Gender Jesus by J. David Hester, is outstanding because it talks about the issue of unicism. Four Sexes and Two Genders by Levi and Parduk. Very fascinating because it talks about the rabbinic history of dealing with gender beyond just the binary concepts. Matthew Kufler's The Manly Eunuch is an outstanding read. It's a little bit harder to get, so try to use your library if you don't want to pay $80. But he goes through a vast history of this. Understanding Christian Art by Robin Jensen. The Matthew's Clash of the Gods is outstanding. And I would also say check out the Bible Search and Rescue, because there's been some great posts there as well.
Thank you. So you all can just take a picture of this little slide here and keep it if you want to look at this further. Oh my goodness. Well, on behalf of everybody here, Chad, I would really like to thank you so much for this very challenging but insightful and helpful conversation tonight. Thank you so much for.
Thank you. For me, I got challenged by Ali and these other scholars, and so I get to bring that to others. So it's been fun.
Yeah, good. You can unshare your screen, and we'll just finish it up here right then.
You got it.
Okay. So anyway, I want to thank everybody also for your participation too. This was the June 2023 textual study for the Bible and Beyond discussions titled Jesus, Gender, and the Importance of Christian Art with guest scholar Dr. Chad Venters. And I expect you know how grateful we are for your donations to be able to produce these textual studies. And we want to especially thank those of you who have pledged your support on Patreon. You're the ones who keep us going. PayPal or checks are always welcome options as well. It's all appreciated, and I hope you know that. So once a month from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday nights, we provide a discussion on a topic related to early Christian texts. We ask one of our knowledgeable scholars to share their knowledge and insights, and we provide time for participants to ask questions and share their own thoughts. So thanks, everybody. It's been a real treat to be with you tonight.